Joining us direct and live from Copenhagen in Denmark, Anne-Mette Sundahl. Thank you for joining us, and good to be speaking to you.
Yeah, nice to be on your show.
I think you're the first person we've had from Denmark. I mean, it's kind of a cool thing to be talking to the other side of the world in your summer.
Yeah.
How's the weather over there? I think that's an important question.
Yeah, so it definitely doesn't feel like summer right now, I must say. It's raining, it's looking very grey and dark, and you definitely can't tell that it's midday because, yeah, it looks like night almost because it's so dark. So, yeah, it's not great.
Now, you've written a piece for The Conversation, and we'll get to that shortly. But the piece for The Conversation has come out of your PhD, and
Yeah.
I'll just bring up your PhD for people. The PhD is entitled Personality Cult or a Mere Matter of Popularity. The paper introduces a theoretical model for distinguishing between mere popularity and personality cults, as there currently is an inflated use of the personality cult concept. So, yeah, we'll get to the article, because the article kind of talks more about do the people who follow like Jacinda Ardern. Is it because she's popular, or is it a personality cult? So we'll get to that in a second. But first of all, do you want to? I know it's very difficult to ask someone doing a PhD to synopsize all of these thoughts that you're putting years and years of effort towards. But what are you looking for? What are you trying to find out when you're looking at the difference between personality cults and popularity?
Yeah, so actually that article you're referring to is just part of my PhD. So
Right.
it's part of a small section of my theory chapter. So like my entire PhD is like so much more than that. So I'm actually looking at images. So I'm like scraping memes and stuff online of Trump and Putin and looking at that to show like how that contributes to their personality cult. But yeah, in terms of the article, it was actually because I just noticed that, um, especially journalists or like political commentators, they quite often use personality cult or use the concept of personality cult to describe the popularity of some politicians
Right.
when it's not actually a personality cult. And I
Right.
thought that was a problem because that kind of misrepresents the popularity of the politician in question, because not only does it make them seem more infallible than they actually are, but it's also it makes them seem a bit dictatorial, because
Right.
the personality cult concept has like some negative connotations, because it was first used, or at least became popularized with Khrushchev's speech where he denounced Stalin. So Stalin is quite often the politician or the leader you would think of when you say personality cult. So there is like an implicit comparison there when you call, for instance, Jacinda Ardern a personality cult politician. So that would make you think of someone like Stalin. And I think that's a problem, because that kind of gives people the impression that she's almighty and powerful, um, uh, and that she can't really be challenged, which is definitely not the case. And I see that quite often in like articles, and even in some scholarly works where there is a bit of like a conceptual confusion. So that's why I decided to write this article, and I actually I kind of conceptualized it as like a continuum. So you have like mere popularity, and then at the other end of the continuum, you have a personality cult, a fully fledged personality cult.
Right.
And then you can maybe place different politicians along that continuum or along that line, right? So it's not like necessarily an either or sort of thing. And I actually, in the article, I mentioned two dimensions. So there is a representational dimension, and then there is a sociological dimension. And then there are three parameters. And then you can actually place the different politicians, so they will score differently. They could potentially have 2 out of 3 characteristics of a personality cult on the representational scale, but no characteristics of a personality cult on the sociological dimension. And then they would, of course, be closer to being just a popular politician on the continuum.
The article we're looking at on the screen right now, if you're watching the video from The Conversation, does Jacinda Ardern's popularity really qualify as a cult of personality, as some critics claim? Before I ask the question about the first bit of highlighted of this, is it that people are using the title personality cult kind of like they're using the title Nazi? Or they're kind of throwing that around at the moment, when actually it's sort of evolving into a coverall for I disagree with your politics, as opposed to being an accurate use of the word.
Yeah, that is definitely how I see it. It's a more like for me, it's like a symptom of like sensationalism, right? Because
Yeah,
it's probably more likely that you'll get some clicks if you call it a cult of personality than if you say that she's just popular.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And I mean that makes sense. And you go through your article and talking about how, at one stage she was 76%, had popularity ratings of 76%, which I think is almost unheard of. I think John Key got close to that after the Christchurch earthquakes, I believe,
Mm,
and that was because there was a time of crisis, and so we looked to our leaders. You define a personality cult. It parallels religious worship, elevating an individual's authority through the deliberate creation, projection, and propagation of a godlike image. I've had quite a lot to do with religious cults. It
mm,
was a bit of a personal passion of mine, sort of, I don't know, back in the late 90s, early 2000s, kind of looking into them and delving into them, and even visiting a few of them and going and looking at them. And so when I hear you talking about people like Trump and Putin in your article, I think about people in those churches or religious organizations and what they used to have to do. The infallible person up the front, all of a
mm,
sudden they had to live with each other and live in all the same circles and not talk to people outside that group. They did the thing called love bombing, where if you come into their cult, they're like your best friend straight away and they just cover you in love. And then if you disagree with their cult, you are spat upon and you're the worst thing in the world. So
mm.
when I hear the word cult per se, that's my personal experience of it. But when you talk about it in a political context and how you're talking about it with Jacinda Ardern versus some others that we'll get into, you think it's pretty clear that she doesn't have that kind of on a pedestal, won't be questioned, because you think about Trump, you think about Trump's followers, and you're like, they never question him no matter what. If they
Mm.
get shown evidence to completely be contrary to what he's saying or showing, they find another way to get to that same answer.
Yeah.
That's not the case for Jacinda, you don't think? Or is it not the case for most of us, but there are still a small portion like that? Or is it really just not in New Zealand? That's not what's happening.
I would say that it's not what's happening
Okay.
whatsoever, because even if you talk to loyal Labour voters, even they would question Jacinda, and that would be unheard of in a cult. And I
Right.
think, okay, yeah, maybe you can find, a few people who be like, oh, Jacinda is the best and she's infallible. But I think as like a general statement, I would say no, that's not what we're seeing in New Zealand, because if Jacinda said, if she, for instance, had lost the election or something, and she
Yeah.
said, "Oh, let's, storm Parliament or something like that and overturn the election results," uh, I don't think anyone would actually go along with that in New Zealand. So I think that's the big difference.
Yeah, I've got some questions for you as well about other characters in New Zealand, and there are some people in New Zealand in the political world or political adjacent world where they would do that, and the protests in Wellington at the end of last year are sort of an example of some of that. But first of all, I wanted to, I guess, read out a bit from your article and demonstrate sort of what you're saying about what people will and won't do for Jacinda, and also what the person needs to do themselves to sort of put themselves on that pedestal to then be that godlike to be worshipped. I mean, you say this over the past few years, artists have depicted Ardern as Wonder Woman, as pop cultural figures like Star Wars Princess Leia or Rosie the Riveter from World War II marketing imagery. But there have been no official attempts from Ardern or the government to depict her as a hero, in stark contrast to how Trump and Putin have contributed to their own glorification. Trump, for example, photoshopped an image, and I think that's the one we can see there, on the face of Rocky Balboa's body and posted it on social media. The Russian government has released numerous official photos of Putin riding around bare-chested in the Siberian wilderness, cultivating an image of the leader as the ideal Russian man. So that's a big part of it, yeah. Basically, if there is, and I'll use the word that's incorrect, but if there was a cult of personality around Jacinda, she's not participating in it, which kind of means it's not a cult of personality.
Yeah. So in order for it to be a cult of personality, you need it to be cultivated from above. So that is quite often where you see it starting, like when at the early stages of a personality cult, it's like the leaders trying to create a certain narrative or convey a certain image of themselves, and then obviously that narrative needs to be accepted by the public. so they need to go along with it. But if you only see the grassroots part of the cult, so it's not cultivated from above, then it's not really a cult, because a cult of personality is also a matter of the leader using that popularity as a means of power. It's a power instrument. And if it's not cultivated from above, that's kind of the leader saying, okay, I'm not going along with it. I'm not using this to get my way or get more power. Or
So there has to be a willing participant to, like my experience of the church, the dude up the front. And I was going to say dude or dudette, but there's never a dudette up the front when it comes to a religious cult. So let's just say the dude up the front. He has to be a willing participant in the conversation to put himself on the pedestal. Even if they are also, he has to be agreeing to putting himself on the pedestal to be the kind of sole source of truth that there is. And I know when I say that, some people are going to criticize me because at one stage, very early on in the COVID outbreak, Jacinda made a statement about being the sole source of truth, the government. Now, that's been blown up out of all proportion currently because people are thinking that that's Jacinda saying the government is the only place you can find truth. What she was actually saying is at the moment on day 2 of the COVID, we're the ones that have the accurate information. Listen to the government right now. So, but people are still using that now like it's current when it was from a couple of years ago. To reiterate a bit what you're saying about this, here's some more of the article. It says Trump, on the other hand, has encouraged, this is about the participating. Trump, on the other hand, has encouraged his supporters to unlawfully storm the Capitol in an attempt to overturn the 2020 presidential election results. Recent congressional hearings have found these supporters rioted after being encouraged by Trump and stopped when Trump told them to go home. And I think that's a huge one. I interviewed the documentary filmmaker 2 weeks ago who made the 3-part series Unprecedented. So I talked to him for an hour and a half, who was on the stage with Trump on the day of January 6th. And I think personally, from looking at all the evidence and listening to what everyone's saying, the point that they stopped when he said stop is almost more damning. Because we can say, I'm going to fight cancer. You can use these words like fight and attack and these things in a metaphorical way. But as soon as you tell people to stop rampaging and they stop, that's like, that to me is almost more a confirmation of who these people were and what control, President Trump has over them.
Yeah, for sure. And then I think it's also significant that there are actually some people saying that he knew about them being armed before he actually encouraged them to riot or storm the Capitol. So I think that's also, it shows that he, at least to some extent, probably knew what he was doing, or he knew that there could be some serious consequences. But actually, I would like to say, in terms of what you were saying about dudes and dudettes, that's actually interesting because in terms of like the traditional scholarly literature on personality cults, one of the key defining characteristics of a personality cult is actually that it's paternalistic. So so it's not even theorized as something that can arise around women, which is not necessarily something I agree with, because I think the reasoning behind it was quite often when we talk about personality cults, we talk about personality cults from like the 50s or something. And that was a different time. So like having a female leader is way more common now. But if we accept the idea of a personality cult actually arising around a woman, like what would it look like? Because it might not necessarily look like the personality cult of a man. Because as we see with like Putin, for instance, it is very gendered. Like he is portrayed as very like super macho, naked upper body sportsman, right? So would that be the same with a woman? So that is also an interesting discussion.
So that's really interesting, and I think straight away that the question could be asked: Can females take on paternalistic qualities as opposed to maternalistic? And I think about what's happening in America at the moment with a whole bunch of people like the Lauren Boeberts of the world, who are sort of the alt-right, clone supporting Republicans, and the information they put out is very, it's very masculine and very strong. It's carrying guns. It's, stuff these snowflakes. It comes across as quite not masculine like they're masculine, but the words they're using and the imagery they're using seems to be very masculine. So that sort of, I don't know, maybe that does sort of line up with what you're saying.
But I also think it's interesting. So it's not something that I've done extensive
Mm.
research on whatsoever, but it's definitely something that I want to do at some stage. But if you look at how the former German Chancellor Angela Merkel was depicted, she was quite often depicted in like the comic strips in newspapers in the like a latex outfit, like a dominatrix, and then she
Right.
was like kind of whipping the other European political leaders. And I think that is quite often like how women are portrayed. So I guess that's a way of making her seem masculine or in charge, but it's also very sexualized in a different way than just Putin riding around bare-chested on a horse.
Yeah,
I think,
it's almost like the only way a woman can have power over a man if there's a sexual element to it.
yeah, exactly.
Whereas a man can have power over a woman just any way they want, but there has to be
Yeah.
that little addendum. By the way,
Yeah.
let's dress her in rubber in the
Yeah.
cartoons, at least. In the
Yeah.
cartoons.
Yeah.
The other thing that's interesting as I think about this is, like, I think about some characters in the New Zealand political world, and we'll talk about them shortly, but it seems that mainstream politics, you don't have these cult figures. They're often fringe. And the difference with what has happened in America is that if we talk about a quote unquote liberal democracy, so that kind of eliminates Russia, you don't have these cult-like figures as the leaders until Trump. And Trump seems to be the anomaly. And I mean, do you have any opinions about what this means for politics in America? Like, someone's found a formula that works. Is it just a formula and they're grifting and playing a job? Or is this a deep-seated issue within the right-wing American politics now?
I think the interesting thing about Trump is that he was seen as anti-establishment.
Yep.
And he was seen as, like, even though he was born into money, he was also seen as like a self-made man, right? And I think that kind of so I think like it wasn't actually because people necessarily liked Trump that he was elected in the first place. It was just because they disliked the establishment. So like,
And
the
they hated
Hillary
Hillary.
Clinton's,
Yeah, totally.
Hillary Clinton, yeah.
Yeah.
But seen from like a more theoretical point of view, that is actually not surprising that then a cult would arise. It would arise around a person like Trump, because it is something that happens around a revolutionary figure, theoretically anyway. So I think that is kind of like what we saw in the States, right? He was this revolutionary figure. He was this person who could change everything, and get rid of crooked Hillary and all the other crooked politicians, right? Yeah.
And the irony being, obviously, one of the most crooked men himself. You just look
Yeah,
at his history and his background, and it's I've done another podcast with a guy called Stephen Lewandowski, who's based out of, I think, Berlin, and he talks about why people fall for conspiracy theories and all of this kind of cults, conspiracy theories. There's so many overlapping. The Venn diagram is very small, with the Venn with the part in the middle being very large. There's a very large crossover. I wanted to ask you about, now I know you're not like a specialist in New Zealand politics, but you've spent time here, so you probably, I'm assuming, have heard of Brian Tamaki.
Yeah.
Yep. So he was one of the people that's in my head that I'm thinking about. The weekend that's just gone, there has been another sort of quote unquote rights and freedoms protest, where Brian Tamaki has come out saying they're starting up, not him personally, but there's a new party starting up. It's going to be an umbrella party, and there's 4 minor parties who have already signed up to it. Of course, he wouldn't tell us what they were. But what it means is, like, he's one of the people that I'm thinking of. He is this figure that if he tells his followers to go and do it, they will. And if it's quote unquote proven that what he's saying is wrong, it won't matter to his followers, because his followers think he literally speaks from God, and he is also God-like. Would he be a good example, as much as you know of him, of someone in New Zealand who's got that sort of cult personality type status?
Well, in general, I would probably refrain from calling him a personality cult figure, because I think it's something that's reserved for political leaders, so like the heads of governments or head of state. Because having a personality cult entails some form of authority, like legitimate authority. So you can actually wield your power over people who don't necessarily agree with you. And that's not the case with Brian Tamaki, right? He has some followers who worship him or see him as infallible, but he doesn't really have power over people who disagree with him.
So there has to be that element of the access to power to which he has none. So that might be a quote unquote cult, but it's not a cult of personality. Okay. So that when you say it like that they need access to power, I can't think of anyone in the New Zealand political scene that would actually fit. Because if they need to have access to the ninth floor of the Beehive, then there's really only two people who potentially have access to it. One is Christopher Luxon, and the other is Jacinda Ardern at the moment.
Yeah,
they're the only two, and neither of those people fit that bill.
No, but I think there was one of the articles that I have linked to in my own opinion piece for the conversation, where it actually says that Jacinda Ardern is a cult of personality politician, and so was John Key. And I feel like that is a very liberal use of the concept. Then that it's just okay if you have a popular politician, then okay they have a personality cult. Because I think I can see why some people might be tempted to say that Jacinda has a personality cult, but I think John Key, I don't see that. I feel like that's even more of a stretch.
But then again, if this conversation was happening, in 3 weeks after the Christchurch quakes, maybe so. I mean, the reason that people seem to be pointing to Jacinda Ardern as having a cult of personality or a personality cult is because of her popularity around COVID. If you hit the conversation at the same time that he was as popular as that, maybe people would have a different perspective. But I think that when you attribute what these things, right, I like to sort of simplify things because I'm a very, very simple man. When you think about these things, like they have to participate in it and they have to have access to power, then that eliminates anyone in New Zealand politics, because even if someone in, say, ACT or the Greens or the Māori Party or something was like that, they don't have access to power. They're not going to be on the ninth floor as the Prime Minister of this country. So, it's actually quite nice to hear that, even though there are some sort of Trumpian-led tactics coming into New Zealand politics, we're not going to see, certainly in the short term, any Trumpian characters in power in New Zealand politics.
No, I don't think so. And also, as I briefly state in the conversation piece towards the end, is I think in New Zealand you just don't have the culture for actually cultivating a cult of personality, because it is a very relatively egalitarian society, and with the tall poppy syndrome and all that sort of stuff, I think it is unlikely that you will see an egalomaniac like Trump or something like that.
I think in New Zealand we're a bit like, oh, settle down, mate. Pull your head in. She'll be right. Come
exactly.
on.
Yeah.
It's a bit on the nose, mate. Come on, let's settle down a bit here, shall we, fellas? Let's have a beer and settle down. No, I think that's a really interesting aspect as well. Our personalities as Kiwis make it less difficult for there to be a cult of personality as a prime minister or one of the major leaders. Because probably if someone did that, they wouldn't, they have to have an element of popularity to them. Our leaders typically need to be quite likable, and most of those people who come off like that, like I'm thinking about the people I know, obviously who haven't been cult of personality because they haven't had the power, but have been like cult-like figures, are basically all pricks and not particularly likable. I mean, they may be able to fool a few people, but overall they're basically assholes. And we're not going to elect an asshole anytime soon. There'd have to be a massive shift in New Zealand voting for that to happen.
Yeah, so I definitely don't think it's a danger in New Zealand that you'll have a cult of personality politician. But I think the danger is if you keep talking about someone like Jacinda Ardern as a cult of personality politician, you will see that people will maybe be a bit more negative towards New Zealand politics, and they'll feel like they'll be less likely to actually engage politically, because they're like, oh, there's no use, right? Doesn't matter. She will just go unchallenged and she can get away with whatever she wants.
It might also mean as well that if someone did pop up, you might miss them. Because if you thought Jacinda Ardern, like they talk about Trump and they're like, this is the person we've warned you about for 40 years. And you sort of missed him coming. And now he's here, the reason that they all talk about the Second Amendment, but they don't understand that, the Second Amendment talking about, a well-armed militia to fight back against the government is actually sort of talking about someone like Trump, but they're the guys who are also talking about their Second Amendment rights. But he's also the example of someone who has literally tried to overthrow democracy, which is what the Second Amendment is for. So they kind of missed it coming in, focusing on what it could be. Then when they saw it, they missed it. So I guess that's maybe a risk as well.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Hey, this has been fascinating. I would love to stay in touch. I'd love to talk to you again. And when does your did you say before you had 7 months left for your PhD?
Yeah, hopefully.
And you said
Hopefully I
this is
won't
just
have to extend.
this is just an article from it. What's the overall PhD, and has it got a title, or what is it actually focused on in particular?
Well, so it's a working title, but I focus on postmodern personality cults. So I argue that we actually need to rethink how we define personality cults, because the personality cults that we see today are different from the personality cults that we saw with Stalin or Mao or a similar sort of political figure in what I would call the modern era. So like in the 50s. So I argue that today we actually see that there are a lot more bottom-up influences. So because of like the internet and social media and smartphones and all that sort of stuff, people can actually contribute more directly to the cult. So you can make a meme of Putin riding a great white shark and post it on Reddit, and it will go viral, and that will be part of the Putin narrative then. And that's not really something that the Kremlin can control in any way. So I think that definitely changes how we perceive personality cults and the power that that entails. So that's what my PhD is about, more generally speaking.
I think straight away of that, I think it was a GIF or a GIF that came out of Donald Trump clotheslining the CNN logo, that kind of thing, which was obviously was a ground roots, from the ground up kind of thing. But then Trump, of course, amplified it by retweeting it. So he participated in it as well. So yeah. Oh, it's fascinating. Anne-Mette Sundahl, thank you for joining us today. As I said, first person speaking to us from Denmark. I'm terribly sorry I just butchered your name terribly there, but I've really appreciated talking to you, and I hope we get a chance to catch up again soon, maybe as you continue to publish on the conversation, and when you get towards the end of your PhD, it would be amazing to have you again.
Yeah, that would be great. Thank you for having me.